morning. Hello, David. How are you today?
Hello. Hey.
Can you just introduce yourself to the viewers of the channel, please?
Sure. I am David Alnwick, and I am, among other things, a magician. Although the shows I do are, I think magicians would probably call them bizarre magic. I've definitely had magicians who've seen my shows refer to it as bizarre. Um, I think when I first made them, I thought they were sort of magic shows, but they're somewhere between, let's say, a play and a magic show.
Mm.
And for the last 14 years, I've performed at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and I make my living by touring around theatres doing that in the UK.
Great. That's really interesting. You should say that. Um, um, Having watched your Mystery of Dracula,
Yes.
and to me, it was I just my definition of it was theatre.
Sure, 100%.
It
Yeah,
was theatre. Um,
yeah,
that's how I would define it. Theatre and story. In fact, there are a lot. I remember reading the reviews from your Fringe show that
sure.
the reviews all mention the storytelling.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where the way in which you market a show obviously is important. My general rule has always been, as long as you don't lie, say whatever you need to get them in, and as long as they leave going, that was great, fine. And I think sometimes a lot of the terms like storytelling, when it's used in the context of a theatrical one-person show, can sometimes, I don't want to say exclusively have negative connotations, but I think it's one of them where, because what I'm doing is like relatively low production value due to the fact that I don't have, some huge theatrical budget, I'm just one person. A lot of people do one person shows, and a lot of those one person shows are often referred to as storytelling. And sometimes people can just like, I mean, personally, I don't go to a lot of shows that would market themselves as storytelling because I often don't think they're going to be very good. You know what I mean? I think they can just be associated with not great stuff. And so, it can be difficult to market what I'm doing because I don't want to be associated with things that aren't good, which
Yeah.
sounds a bit like, I don't know. I hope that doesn't sound like egotistical. And maybe it does. I don't know.
No, no,
But
no. You're trying to do things right and professionally. Um,
sure,
it's yeah. I mean, storytelling for me is a big part of bizarre magic. In
sure,
the
of course.
stories are important, more important really than the effect, and
There's a solid
often
argument to be made.
the effect is to reinforce the story. But
Yes.
let's face it, storytelling is probably the oldest form of entertainment there is, since humankind could speak. You can imagine sat round a campfire in a cave or in a round house in the Neolithic. Stories would have been told.
100%. I think when you read like some of Eugene Berger's stuff, I forget Magic and Meaning. Um, he talks about, shamanism and the oldest forms of, because we think of that as, oh, wizards. But really, there was a time when the idea of like wizard was synonymous with priest, scientist, like every magician, all of those things were kind of one thing. And I do agree. I think like, storytelling and the mechanics by which a story works is as much a structured effect, you could say. Like it's a structure that's designed to have an effect on our brain, right? Like if you tell a story properly, people can't help but be engaged.
Engaged,
And
engaged.
that,
That's the word.
same as you're going to do a magic trick, they can't help but be amazed, if you want to call it that. If you do a jump scare, they can't help but be frightened. If you tell a joke, they can't help but laugh. They're all just different mechanical procedures by which to affect an emotional response. And there is a good argument that story is kind of the God particle of all of those things combined in a
Mm-hmm.
way. I think that's a reasonable thing to say.
Well,
Yeah.
in my introduction to the Black Magic Theatre show, I used to say that that which man understands, he calls science. That which man has yet to understand, he calls magic.
100%. Yeah.
So you'll see exactly the correlation between shamanism, magic, etc. Now, I think you've got 3 shows currently.
Yes.
What have we got? The Necromancer, the Signalman, and the Mystery of Dracula.
Yeah, those are
Can
the
you tell
ones
us
that have all
about
been performed.
can you tell us about the format of the shows?
Yeah, well, they're pretty different. So the Mystery of Dracula show, which you've seen a video of, is a. Well, I tell you what, I'll talk about Signalman first, actually, because that's the easiest. So the Signalman show was, like, I mean, I perform for a living, so but I perform in theaters. So obviously, I'm creating shows, thinking to myself, well, these shows need to be marketable, and they need to be good, but also sometimes within a time frame from conception to execution do the shows need to happen. Just because of the nature of, like, when you're doing theater, you will, especially for a new show, you will book dates at a theater and create all of the marketing and the imagery before the show exists, before the show is written, which is obviously a daft way to do it, but it's the way you have to do it because, otherwise you create a show and then have to do another 6-month window to market it, right? So you want to conflate that.
Yes.
So for the Signalman, I wanted to do a sort of Dickensian style, just reading of the Signalman, like Charles Dickens used to do of his own stories, touring theatres,
indeed,
quite literally reading off the page.
Yeah.
And I trained as an actor, and I'm all right at it, and the Signalman has always been my favourite Charles Dickens story. So when I first did that show, I was performing it. I booked to do it in January, which was around the Christmas period, because Charles Dickens' ghost stories, which is kind of a concept that he invented, the sort of Christmas ghost story, or at the very least popularized, but kind of invented. So I knew if I did Charles Dickens' Signalman at Christmas, that was probably going to sell tickets. And I knew that the end of the show, the bulk of the show, was just going to be a straight reading of that. But because I love magic, and because that's like a USP and people know me as doing kind of magic, I wanted to fit magic into the show. But in this show, because like I had the shortest time frame to do it, what I did was I had a book that I picked up from a charity shop ages prior on Victorian parlor games. It's called Victorian Parlor Games. I think it was written in the 1970s. And that became, like at the beginning of the show, I told a story which sort of set the scene of Victorian parlor, that like the time in which Dickens was performing these stories, right?
Yeah.
And then essentially I performed a series of effects that were based on Victorian parlor games. And they kind of weren't, but it was framed as though they were. And because the magic was pretty solid, people were really into that. And what was interesting is my sister, who works with me, often has the advantage of listening to the audience as they're leaving and entering.
Right. That's
which was lovely, because she commented that even though in my head I was thinking to myself, is this kind of a tenuous link? She overheard people saying, it was like they were really invested in the idea that what I was doing was performing alterations of Victorian parlor games, and simply putting the magic in that context totally evolved what I was doing. Like it just made it more fun. Like, it's the difference between saying, here's a magic trick, or here's an old Victorian parlor game. The latter is fundamentally more interesting to most people, especially people who are going to see a Charles Dickens theatre show. And so that show was very much, first half was magic, dressed up as parlor games. Second half was a straightforward reading. And there was a little bit of a narrative between to do with the true story behind why Charles Dickens wrote The Signalman. So that was that show. And so that's the most basic setup, I would say, in terms of half magic, half storytelling, both kind of separate, but thematically linked. The Mystery of Dracula is a show where that was my big attempt at my first, sort of my second big attempt. I did a show called Nightmare Magic before any of these. And Nightmare Magic was not very good. That's probably unfair. It got like some good reviews, but like it was a very disjointed show. And I was really trying to experiment with how can you mix narrative with magic. Because I think a big problem with, and do stop me when I start going on, because I will. This is all I think about. And I've got no one to talk to about it. Because it's so niche. I think the big thing with, bizarre magic or storytelling magic is the way in which you combine the narrative with the magic, right? And I think a lot of the time that can be, and I've got nothing against this, but a lot of the time that can be association by analogy. It's something Darwin Ortiz talked about in his book Strong Magic, which is like you can perform magic as a demonstration, experimentation, or one of those things was analogy. And I think when you watch a lot of Eugene Berger's sort of old narrative stuff, like his sort of gypsy thread with the Vishnu, that story.
Can I just interrupt you
Go on.
slightly
Yeah,
there?
yeah.
Because Eugene Berger's gypsy thread, I think, is the absolute classic. The way he combines
So that's very interesting.
It is not, I do this, I do that, and then this happens, which I hate. It's absolutely from start to finish, every word is thought out and it combines everything.
I concur.
Yeah.
It might be worth putting a link to that performance in the description of this video.
I will do. I've got on my YouTube channel, I've got that performance in one of my lessons. I can't remember which number, in the performance of Bizarre Magic. I actually used a clip of Eugene doing the gypsy thread.
Perfect. Link that in.
Compare it with other people, magicians doing the gypsy thread, and it is just a different universe.
It is that's a funny phrase when you think about what he's talking about. But this is it, right? So on one base level, you've got the fundamental effect, which is the gypsy thread. I break a piece of thread apart, it restores, right? Now, by its very nature, that is entertaining because something impossible happens, which triggers our amazement, right? Now, on a base level, that's fine, right? In the same way, and the example I always give is if you watch like a scene of Jackie Chan doing an action sequence, it's spectacular to watch, right? Of course it is. And it's incredibly well choreographed and beautifully performed. But the problem is, at a certain point, you go, so what? Now, if it's an ends to a means, that's fine. But the so what is kind of the reason that magic as an art form, and this is stuff I obviously go on about in the TED Talk, is kind of down here. Whereas anything that's got story in is always way up here. Movies, books, video games, pick any other medium, it is more artistically relevant than magic. And I don't even think that's a matter of opinion. That's just like a matter of fact, given that look at the market, right? Like, look at how much tickets are sold up here versus how many. I mean, don't get me wrong, David Copperfield is very rich, but he is one, and even David Copperfield says, the thing I brought to magic was story. Like, he says that in his GQ interview. Whether or not you agree with that, fair enough, but contextualizing the magic matters. It's the reason that watching a clip of Jackie Chan compilations isn't as good as watching a movie, because the story adds the narrative weight to the moment of action, right? That being said, bringing it back to Eugene Berger, doing the gypsy thread, it is very, very good. And it's the best example I could give of magic by analogy, right? Because the story he is telling is, you could argue, thematically linked to the effect he's doing, right? But the link, it's definitely separate, because the story exists on one plane and the magic exists on the other plane. Everyone knows that what he's doing isn't a literal demonstration of the magic of Vishnu, right?
Yes.
It's an analogous demonstration.
Analogy.
Exactly. It's by analogy. Now, that's good, but I could argue you could go deeper than that, because if you think about experimentation or demonstration, both of those are happening in the present tense, not the past tense, right? So instead of one story being like, oh, here's a representation of the story I'm telling, this is the story I'm telling. Like, the thing that is happening, and we talked about, there's an effect I do in Dracula, which is telekinetic timber, and you just released a video on a different version of a similar effect. Go on, called. It'll tell me what it's called for the sake of it now.
The Lost Chair.
The Lost Chair. Same effect, right? Which is, you could call it a psychokinetic, an animation effect, whereby something moves and it's impossible, right? Now, when I do it in Dracula, and I'm not saying this is perfect by any stretch, but the way I do it is that when it happens, I use the classic sort of, what would you call it? Like not trope, but like, it's not meant to happen, right? Like, something happens and that wasn't meant to happen, right? Now, that as an idea of, oh, that wasn't supposed to happen, immediately that's live. That is in the moment, right? That is not me going, hey, look at that falling over a bit of wood. That is representational of something that happened eons ago or something. That's like, whoa, what just happened? That's in the room right now. That's a present moment thing, which means that there's no fourth wall now. The audience and me, well, that doesn't mean there's no fourth wall, but in the show there isn't. It means right now we're all in a moment that is happening. And that immediacy, I think, is really, I mean, it elevates it, right? It's a more powerful moment. You know, it creates a stronger moment. And stuff like that is what I wanted to do with the Mystery of Dracula. I didn't want the magic to be exclusively, here's an analogy of a story. I want it to be, here's a demonstration or here's an experiment, all of which is happening right now to illustrate the narrative. And yeah, so the Mystery of Dracula, to actually get back to the question, which is what is the structure of that show? So it's not a retelling of Dracula. It is me using the novel Dracula as a jumping off point. Arguably, you know, like this is exactly the problem I've got with that show, is the way to market the narrative. I mean, the crux of the narrative is I, David Alnwick, after performing an occult illusion show, am approached by a stranger who gives me a photocopied page from an old occult publication. And the photocopy is of a review, a Victorian written review, supposedly reviewing an occult demonstration, a Victorian occult demonstration that has an unusual similarity to the novel Dracula. That, for character reasons, interests me enough that I try to discover whoever performed the thing that is being reviewed. And that thread, that investigation of trying to discover the identity of the performer, is the through line of the show, which takes us on a journey behind the inspiration of the novel Dracula, specifically the inspiration of the folklore, the occult history, the supernatural, spooky stuff that is, you know, like covered in truth of, you know, Bram Stoker was a jobbing writer. He wrote Dracula intentionally to be successful. He wanted it to sell copies, and he wrote a book for an audience full of Victorian spiritualists who were into occult. And he did a lot of research into like Romanian folklore and other aspects, like even Icelandic folklore, to you know, make it feel real. Like the point of Dracula was it was meant to feel real. Go on.
I've been to Castle.
Oh, no way.
Yes, in fact, part of my research, I managed to work it in with our 25th wedding anniversary. We went to Romania on holiday and visited Castle and places like that. So
how was it? Was it beautiful? I'd love to go out there.
It's you know? We went before Romania really started to get commercialized, but
sure.
It's imagine, you know, if you were going to invent Dracula's castle, that would be it.
That would be it.
The link, the historical link with Vlad Dracul.
Sure.
Or no, sorry, Draculia, because as you say in your show, he was Vlad Tepes.
Yes.
His father was known as Vlad the Dragon.
Yeah.
There's various interpretations of it, Vlad Dracul. And Draculia, the Ilia added on the end, is like Mac in Scotland. It means son of. So Vlad Draculia meant son of the dragon.
Son of the dragon.
To his father, you say.
It's the stuff like that. Just being able to, that's a good example of like, you know, if you're going to tell a story, there's like finding, and this is why I think horror is such an interesting genre and so closely linked to magic in a way, because it's a genre that's based on an effect, which is a jump scare, same as like magic is based on a trick. But like often with horror, they will take a story like the one you just told me, like they will base it in history, usually like some ancient spooky history, and it just adds a veneer of authenticity, doesn't it, to the story?
Just can you give me a second? I'll just,
of course,
let's see if I can find it. Oh yes, there it is.
Oh right, is that from the?
That is the guidebook that I bought when we went to Bran Castle.
I can't visit you because I'd love to have a look through that library of stuff behind you.
I also have an original watercolor. In fact, I think it's in this of the house where Vlad Tepes was born, and I bought it
all right.
at um, at the village where the house is, and this is the house where Vlad Dracul was born, and there's an artist outside doing pictures of the house, and I bought one of the. Just bear with me a second.
Go on, do it. Oh wow, that's really good. Hold it in front of your face because it's the focus is off. Yeah, like in front of your face because the camera will want to focus on your face.
Yeah. So that's the house where Dracula was born, and that was the original watercolor that was painting this. And I think doing things like that, doing that research, helps because exactly as I mean, the reason I've just shown that is because I think it demonstrates that the research gives an authenticity.
Yes.
A lot of the stories I do, I actually are based in real places.
100%.
So
yeah.
I've looked at old maps and I've looked at old stories, and I mean that's what you're doing. And can I just mention this? You said about the set was what did you call it? Not austere, minimal, or something. I can't remember the word you used to describe it, but that was good. I like that. You've got the like the strings, I suppose you call,
sure,
and you're pinning the pictures on as you talk about it. Very effective. And Dr. Natalie,
sure,
who's doctorate PhDs in theatre, she'll explain it much better than me, but I've seen some shows she's worked with, and there is absolutely minimal setting. And if you've got a black stage, you only need the right music and the right lighting, and you don't need an expensive set.
It's true. It's true.
You know,
it's
we
tricky.
It works, especially the music works on people's minds.
Yeah,
and their
you can tell a powerful story just with the imagination. I think like it's hard to do, and it's something that I'm trying my best to like come up with new ideas for. What can I transport? What isn't expensive? What packs small and will come out. But like invoke something. For sure.
When where is it now? It's up there somewhere. When we were doing the Black Magic Theatre show at first, I was taking 2 big cab speakers with me, a big amp, lots of lighting, and it's difficult to carry around, set up, etc. Especially if you're working in hotels and your tradesman's entrance is at the back and you've got all through carrying stuff. Nowadays, a little Bose speaker set, the small Bose things, incredible sound, and your phone, and you've got the sound system.
100%. It's way easier than it used to be.
But I love when you're a minimalist, like you've got the dark background and the photos and documents you're pinning up, it draws attention to them. They're not lost in the background. It's not a messy background.
Well said. And I think that's valuable because you can definitely use that. Like in the Dracula show, obviously, it was like, right, well, if I pin one thing up before the audience come in, the audience look at that thing and go, what, like, that you giving the audience some kind of focus within minimalism, I think, is a good idea. Especially because it's an easy idea. I think anything you can do that's just when you don't have a big budget, you've got to be smart. It's as simple as that, isn't it? Like if I could say, build a literal castle on stage, like National Theatre, I'd do it. Of course, I'd do it, but I can't. So, like suggest the idea of that.
Yeah. Another thing I noticed that was you used the clip of Vincent Price talking about
Christopher Lee.
Yeah, and I've got that very clip with the visuals in one of the videos I did in my lessons in the presentation about bizarre magic. What is magic?
Sure.
I actually used that clip.
Yeah, man. This is what I mean. Like, if you do the research,
you see,
you find the gold.
I think that because people, I don't know whether I should say this. I don't believe in ghosts.
Sure.
Right. I don't. But most people, perhaps even if they don't believe in ghosts, have something at the back of their mind. Think, well, you don't quite know. And if you can invoke a feeling that, what was that? Might that be? It gives them an emotional hook into what you're doing, and so they don't have to believe. But if they leave thinking, not how did he do that, but what happened? How is that possible? Oh, well, we're running out. Has that come up on your screen?
It has.
Right. Okay. In that case, that just shows I haven't paid for the big version of Zoom. Right. I think we've still got loads to talk about, but obviously we're about to lose transmission. I don't know what you'd call it. So
you could always just resend the link if you'd like.
If that works, we'll try that. So I'll stop now and I'll resend the link and we'll see what's happening.
Sure.
Okay.